Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the controls of her CH-47 Chinook helicopter as it cut through the dusty Afghan sky. The twin rotors churned steadily above her head, their familiar rhythm providing little comfort on this particular morning. She had been flying rescue missions for 3 years, but something felt different about today's operation. The radio chatter from base had been unusually tense, and the mission briefing had been shorter than usual. Beside her, co-pilot Lieutenant Jake Morrison checked their coordinates for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. His nervous energy was infectious, and Sarah found herself double-checking her instruments more frequently than normal. They were heading toward a remote valley in Helmand Province, where a small Marine reconnaissance team had been conducting surveillance operations for the past week. The mission was supposed to be routine: pick up the 4-man team, designated Bravo 7, and return them to base. Intelligence reports indicated minimal enemy activity in the area, which should have made Sarah feel better. Instead, it made her more suspicious. In her experience, when intelligence said an area was quiet, it usually meant they weren't looking hard enough. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez led Bravo 7 from their concealed position on a rocky outcrop overlooking a suspected Taliban supply route. For 6 days, his team had watched trucks and motorcycles move through the valley below, documenting movement patterns and radio frequencies. Rodriguez was a veteran of 2 previous deployments, and his instincts had kept his men alive through dozens of dangerous situations. With him were Corporal Tommy Chen, a communications specialist whose baby face belied his expertise with electronic warfare equipment. Private First Class David Washington operated their reconnaissance equipment, his keen eyes spotting details others missed. The youngest member of the team was Private Miguel Santos, barely 21 years old, but already proving himself as a reliable point man. The morning had started like any other. Chen had established communication with base at 0600 hours, reporting no significant activity during the night watch. Washington had photographed a convoy of 3 trucks that passed through around dawn, uploading the images through their satellite link. Santos had rotated back from his forward observation post, reporting clear sight lines in all directions. Rodriguez checked his watch. Their extraction was scheduled for 1400 hours, still 6 hours away. He settled back against the rocks, allowing himself to relax slightly. The hardest part of any reconnaissance mission was often the waiting. His men had performed flawlessly, gathering valuable intelligence without being detected. Soon they would be back at base, debriefing over hot meals and cold drinks. At Forward Operating Base Chapman, Colonel James Patterson reviewed the morning's intelligence reports with growing concern. Intercepted Taliban communications suggested increased activity in the region where Bravo 7 was operating. The enemy fighters were apparently planning something significant, though the exact nature remained unclear. Patterson called his intelligence officer, Major Lisa Park, into his office. The map spread across his desk showed Bravo 7's position marked with a red circle, surrounded by areas highlighted in yellow indicating possible Taliban presence. What worried Patterson most was a series of intercepted radio transmissions from the previous night, suggesting enemy forces were actively searching for something in that exact region. "Major, I want you to contact Captain Mitchell immediately," Patterson ordered. "Move up the extraction time. I want Bravo 7 out of there in 2 hours, not 6. Park nodded and reached for the secure radio, but before she could make contact, the radio crackled to life with an urgent transmission from another aircraft in the area. A British Tornado reconnaissance jet had spotted large numbers of vehicles converging on the valley where Bravo 7 was positioned. The pilot estimated at least 40 fighters in trucks and on motorcycles, all moving toward the Marines' location. Patterson felt his stomach drop. Intelligence had been wrong again. The valley wasn't quiet. It was about to become a battlefield. On the ground, Rodriguez heard the vehicles before he saw them. The distant rumble of engines echoed off the valley walls, growing steadily louder. He grabbed his binoculars and crawled to the edge of their position, peering down into the valley below. What he saw made his blood run cold. A convoy of pickup trucks and motorcycles was winding up the mountain road, headed directly toward their position. Rodriguez counted at least 12 vehicles, each carrying multiple armed fighters. Behind them, more dust clouds suggested additional forces following. The Taliban had found them. "Chen, get on the radio now," Rodriguez hissed. "Emergency extraction immediate." Chen frantically worked his radio equipment, trying to establish contact with base. The enemy vehicles were less than 2 kilometers away and closing fast. Washington and Santos gathered their equipment, preparing for a fighting withdrawal to an alternate extraction point they had identified during their initial reconnaissance. The radio crackled with static, then Chen's face went pale. "Sergeant, I'm getting multiple enemy transmissions on our frequency. They're jamming us. I can't get through to base." Rodriguez realized they were in serious trouble. The Taliban wasn't just randomly searching the area. They had specific intelligence about Bravo 7's location and mission. Someone had compromised their operation, and now 40 enemy fighters were climbing toward their position while their communications were being blocked. Sarah Mitchell was 30 minutes out from the planned extraction site when her radio erupted with panicked transmissions. Multiple aircraft in the area were reporting enemy activity, and the operation was being upgraded from routine extraction to combat rescue. Her orders were to abort the mission and return to base immediately. "Negative control," Sarah responded firmly. "I have 4 Marines on the ground. I'm not leaving them." The response from base was immediate and uncompromising. "Dragon 6, you are ordered to return to base immediately. We have reports of significant enemy presence in your area. Do not proceed to extraction point." Sarah looked at her co-pilot, who shrugged and shook his head. "Sarah, we've got orders. Base knows what they're doing." But Sarah had a sick feeling in her stomach. She had flown enough missions to know when something was seriously wrong. The urgency in the radio transmissions, the sudden upgrade to combat status, the orders to abort, it all pointed to one conclusion. Bravo 7 was in immediate danger, and abandoning them now meant leaving them to die. She made a decision that would define the rest of her career. Instead of turning toward base, she banked left and increased speed toward the extraction coordinates. "Jake, I need you to trust me on this. Those Marines need us, and we're the only help they're going to get." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, then nodded grimly. "Orders are orders, Sarah, but sometimes orders are wrong." On the ground, Rodriguez watched helplessly as the Taliban fighters deployed around their position. The enemy had superior numbers and knew exactly where the Marines were located. Their only advantage was the rocky terrain, which provided some cover, but also trapped them on the mountainside. The first shots rang out at 13:47 hours, 13 minutes before their scheduled extraction time. Santos spotted enemy fighters moving up the eastern approach and opened fire with his M4 rifle. Washington engaged targets to the south while Chen continued trying to break through the radio jamming. Rodriguez coordinated their defense, knowing they could hold their position for maybe 30 minutes before being overrun. The Taliban fighters showed no concern for casualties, advancing steadily despite taking losses from the Marines' accurate fire. Rodriguez realized they were dealing with experienced fighters who understood small unit tactics. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a carefully planned ambush. "Sergeant!" Chen shouted over the gunfire. "I'm getting fragments through the jamming. There's aircraft in the area, but I can't establish clear communication." Rodriguez felt a flicker of hope. If there were friendly aircraft nearby, they might have a chance. But as he watched more enemy fighters positioning themselves around their location, he knew they were running out of time. The Taliban was setting up for a final assault that would overwhelm their small defensive position. Sarah Mitchell heard the gunfire before she saw the muzzle flashes. The distinctive crack of M4 rifles, mixed with the heavier reports of AK-47s, echoed across the valley. Smoke was rising from multiple points on the mountainside, indicating an intense firefight was already underway. "There!" Morrison pointed toward a rocky outcrop where they could see muzzle flashes from both sides. "That's got to be our guys." Sarah began her descent toward the valley floor, looking for a landing zone close enough to reach the Marines, but far enough from the fighting to avoid taking fire during the extraction. The terrain was challenging, with steep slopes and scattered boulders limiting her options. As they approached, Sarah could see the tactical situation clearly. 4 Marines were defending a position near the top of the ridge, while approximately 30 Taliban fighters had surrounded them on 3 sides. The enemy was preparing for a coordinated assault that would overwhelm the Marine position within minutes. "Dragon 6, this is Bravo 7. Rodriguez's voice suddenly came through clearly on the radio. "We are under heavy fire and need immediate extraction. We have approximately 30 enemy fighters closing on our position." Sarah keyed her microphone. "Bravo 7, this is Dragon 6. I have visual on your position. Stand by for extraction." The relief in Rodriguez's voice was unmistakable. "Dragon 6, be advised there are enemy fighters between our position and any possible landing zone. We'll need to fight our way to you." Sarah studied the terrain below, calculating distances and angles. The nearest suitable landing zone was 300 meters from the Marine position, across open ground covered by enemy fire. Getting the Marines to her helicopter would require them to break through Taliban positions while under fire from multiple directions. But Sarah Mitchell had never left Marines behind, and she wasn't about to start now. Sarah Mitchell circled her Chinook helicopter around the battlefield, studying every possible approach to the trapped Marines. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves cleverly, using the rocky terrain to create overlapping fields of fire that would make any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. But Sarah had trained for situations exactly like this, and she wasn't going to let 4 Marines die on her watch. "Jake, I need you to take over communications," she told her co-pilot. "Keep base informed of our status, but don't ask for permission. I'm going to need all my focus on flying." Morrison nodded and switched radio frequencies. Within seconds, angry voices from headquarters were demanding to know why Dragon 6 was still in the combat zone, instead of returning to base as ordered. Jake turned down the volume and focused on monitoring tactical communications instead. Down on the mountainside, Rodriguez watched the helicopter circling overhead and felt a surge of hope mixed with concern. The Chinook was a large, vulnerable target, and the Taliban fighters were already redirecting some of their fire toward the aircraft. Several enemy fighters had pulled out shoulder-fired rocket launchers, and Rodriguez knew that one lucky shot could bring down the helicopter. "Chen, can you reach Dragon 6 directly?" Rodriguez asked while firing at advancing Taliban positions. "Affirmative, Sergeant," Chen replied. "I've got clear comms with the bird." Rodriguez keyed his microphone. "Dragon 6, be advised we have enemy fighters with RPGs targeting your aircraft. Recommend you maintain distance until we can neutralize those threats." Sarah's voice came back immediately. "Understood, Bravo 7. We're not leaving without you. What's your plan?" Rodriguez quickly assessed their tactical situation. The Marines held the high ground, but were surrounded on 3 sides. The Taliban fighters were advancing steadily, using fire and movement tactics to close the distance. Within 10 minutes, enemy fighters would be close enough to overwhelm their position with grenades and close-quarters combat. "Dragon 6, we need to create a diversion," Rodriguez transmitted. "Can you lay down suppressive fire on the eastern approach? We'll use that to break contact and move toward the LZ." Sarah studied the terrain below. The eastern approach was a steep slope dotted with boulders where several Taliban fighters had taken cover. Her door gunners could target that area without risking the Marines' position, but it would expose the helicopter to return fire from multiple directions. "Roger that, Bravo 7. Stand by for gun run on eastern approach." Sarah banked the Chinook toward the enemy positions, descending to an altitude that would allow her door gunners to engage effectively. The aircraft's two M240 machine guns opened up simultaneously, sending streams of tracer rounds into the Taliban positions. The effect was immediate and devastating. Enemy fighters scattered from the eastern slope as 7.62mm rounds shattered rocks and kicked up clouds of dust around their positions. Several Taliban fighters were hit, and the rest sought cover deeper among the boulders. The intense suppressive fire bought the Marines precious time to begin their movement. "Moving now!" Rodriguez shouted into his microphone. The four Marines bounded down from their defensive position in a coordinated leapfrog pattern. Santos led the way, using his knowledge of the terrain to guide them toward the landing zone. Washington and Chen provided covering fire while Rodriguez coordinated their movement and maintained communication with the helicopter. The Taliban fighters quickly realized what was happening and began redirecting their fire toward the moving Marines. Bullets whined off rocks and kicked up dirt around the Americans as they sprinted and crawled across the mountainside. Sarah continued her gun runs, trying to keep enemy heads down. But there were too many Taliban positions to suppress them all. "Dragon 6, we're taking heavy fire," Rodriguez reported as his team took cover behind a large boulder outcrop. "Multiple enemies between us and the LZ." Sarah could see the problem clearly. The Marines had made it halfway to the landing zone, but Taliban fighters had moved to cut off their route. Enemy positions now formed a semicircle between the Marines and safety, with overlapping fields of fire that would be suicide to cross. "Bravo 7, hold your position," Sarah transmitted. "I'm coming to you." Morrison looked at her in alarm. "Sarah, we can't land in that terrain. It's too steep and rocky." Sarah was already maneuvering the large helicopter toward the Marine position. "We're not landing, Jake. We're doing a rope insertion in reverse." Understanding dawned on Morrison's face. Sarah was planning to hover the Chinook close to the Marine position and extract them using ropes. A dangerous maneuver in calm conditions, but potentially suicidal under enemy fire. The helicopter would be a stationary target for several minutes while the Marines climbed aboard. "Sarah, that's crazy. We'll be sitting ducks." "Those Marines will be dead in 5 minutes if we don't try," Sarah replied grimly. "Get the crew ready for rope extraction." The helicopter's crew chief, Sergeant Mike O'Brien, had been monitoring their conversation. A veteran of 3 combat tours, he immediately understood what needed to be done. He and his assistant began preparing extraction ropes while the door gunners continued engaging Taliban positions. Sarah brought the Chinook into a hover 30 feet above the Marines' position. The aircraft's massive rotors kicked up a cloud of dust and debris that provided some concealment, but also made visibility difficult for everyone involved. Enemy fire immediately intensified, with bullets striking the helicopter's armored hull and shattering several windows. "Ropes deployed!" O'Brien shouted over the rotor noise. 2 thick ropes dropped down to where the Marines huddled behind the rocks. Rodriguez looked up at the hovering aircraft, its crew risking their lives to save his team. Tracer rounds were streaking past the helicopter from multiple directions, and he could see sparks where bullets struck the aircraft's engines and rotor housing. "Santos, you're first up," Rodriguez ordered. "Chen, provide cover fire." Santos grabbed the rope and began climbing as fast as his equipment would allow. Chen and Washington fired at Taliban positions while Rodriguez coordinated the extraction and watched for incoming RPGs. The young Marine made it halfway up the rope before enemy fighters adjusted their aim and began targeting him specifically. Bullets whined past Santos as he climbed, several coming close enough to tear holes in his uniform. The helicopter crew chief reached down and grabbed Santos by his equipment harness, hauling him the last few feet into the aircraft. 1 Marine down, 3 to go. "Washington, you're next," Rodriguez shouted. But before Washington could reach the rope, the distinctive whoosh of an incoming RPG round made everyone dive for cover. The rocket-propelled grenade streaked past the helicopter's nose, missing by less than 20 feet before exploding against the mountainside above them. "Dragon 6, we have RPGs targeting the aircraft," Rodriguez transmitted urgently. "You need to break contact." Sarah's response was immediate and definitive. "Negative, Bravo 7. We're getting all of you out of here." Another RPG round streaked toward the helicopter, this one passing directly under the aircraft before impacting the slope below. The Taliban fighters were getting the range, and Sarah knew they had maybe one more minute before a lucky shot brought them down. Washington reached the rope and began climbing rapidly. The middle-aged Marine moved with surprising agility, hauling himself hand over hand toward the aircraft. Halfway up, a bullet grazed his shoulder, but he continued climbing without slowing down. O'Brien grabbed him and pulled him into the cabin just as another RPG round exploded nearby. "Chen, move!" Rodriguez ordered. The communications specialist sprinted to the rope and began climbing. As the lightest member of the team, he made rapid progress, but Taliban fighters were converging on their position from multiple directions. Rodriguez could see enemy fighters less than 50 meters away, advancing under cover of suppressive fire from their comrades. Chen made it into the helicopter just as Taliban fighters reached the rocks where the Marines had been taking cover. Rodriguez was alone on the ground, surrounded by enemy fighters, with his only escape route a rope hanging from a helicopter taking heavy fire. "Sergeant, move your ass!" O'Brien shouted from above. Rodriguez grabbed the rope and started climbing, but immediately came under direct fire from Taliban fighters who had reached his former position. Bullets struck the rocks around him and whined past his head as he hauled himself upward. The rope swayed wildly as the helicopter pilot made evasive maneuvers to avoid incoming fire. 20 feet up the rope, Rodriguez felt a burning sensation in his leg as a bullet grazed his thigh. He looked down to see Taliban fighters pointing AK-47s directly at him from less than 30 meters away. Above him, the helicopter's door gunners were engaging the enemy fighters, but there were too many targets spread across too wide an area. Another RPG round streaked toward the helicopter, this one tracking directly toward the main rotor assembly. Sarah saw it coming and threw the Chinook into a violent, evasive maneuver, causing Rodriguez to swing wildly on the rope. The RPG missed by inches, but the sudden movement nearly caused Rodriguez to lose his grip. "Hold on, Sergeant," O'Brien shouted, reaching down toward the Marine. Rodriguez looked up to see the crew chief extending his hand downward. Around him, bullets continued to snap through the air as Taliban fighters concentrated their fire on the last American still within range. The helicopter shuddered under multiple impacts, and warning lights began flashing on Sarah's instrument panel. With his strength fading and enemy fighters closing in from all sides, Rodriguez made one final effort to reach safety. He hauled himself up the rope with everything he had left, stretching his arm toward O'Brien's outstretched hand. The crew chief grabbed Rodriguez's wrist and pulled him into the aircraft just as another RPG round exploded directly below them. "All Marines aboard," O'Brien reported. Sarah immediately pulled the helicopter away from the mountainside, gaining altitude and distance from the Taliban positions. Behind them, enemy fighters continued firing, but they were quickly moving out of effective range. The immediate danger was over, but Sarah knew their troubles were just beginning. As she flew toward base, Sarah's radio crackled with angry transmissions from headquarters. Colonel Patterson's voice was furious as he demanded explanations for why Dragon 6 had disobeyed direct orders and conducted an unauthorized rescue mission. "Captain Mitchell, you are ordered to report to my office immediately upon landing." Patterson's voice was cold with anger. "You have violated direct orders and endangered your aircraft and crew." Sarah keyed her microphone calmly. "Understood, Colonel. Dragon 6 returning to base with all personnel recovered." In the cabin behind her, Rodriguez was helping Chen bandage Washington's shoulder wound while Santos checked his equipment for damage. The 4 Marines were alive, but Sarah knew her career was probably over. She had broken the chain of command and disobeyed direct orders, even though her actions had saved 4 American lives. Morrison looked at her with concern. "Sarah, You know they're going to court-martial you for this. Sarah nodded grimly as the base came into view ahead of them. Yeah, I know. But those Marines are going home to their families tonight. That's what matters. Behind them, the mountains of Afghanistan faded into the distance. But the consequences of Sarah's decision were just beginning to unfold. The Chinook helicopter touched down at Forward Operating Base Chapman, with smoke trailing from bullet holes in its armored hull. Sarah Mitchell powered down the engines while emergency crews rushed toward the aircraft to assess the damage and treat any wounded personnel. The weight of what she had just done settled on her shoulders as she watched Colonel Patterson striding across the landing pad with his jaw set in a hard line. Behind her in the passenger cabin, the 4 rescued Marines were helping each other down from the aircraft. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez limped slightly from his leg wound, while Corporal Washington had his arm in a makeshift sling. Despite their injuries, all 4 men were talking and joking with the helicopter crew, the relief of survival evident in their voices. Sarah unbuckled her harness and prepared to face the consequences of her decision. Lieutenant Morrison placed a hand on her shoulder before she could stand up. "Sarah, you did the right thing," he said quietly. "Whatever happens next, remember that." Sarah nodded and climbed out of the pilot's seat. Through the cockpit window, she could see Colonel Patterson approaching with Major Park and several other officers. Behind them came medical personnel to treat the wounded Marines. But Patterson's attention was focused entirely on Sarah. The confrontation began before Sarah even reached the ground. Patterson's face was red with anger as he pointed an accusing finger at her. "Captain Mitchell, you are under arrest for disobeying direct orders, endangering personnel, and conducting unauthorized combat operations," Patterson announced loudly enough for everyone on the flight line to hear. "Security, escort Captain Mitchell to the holding facility." 2 military police officers stepped forward, but before they could reach Sarah, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez limped between them and the pilot. Despite his wounds and exhaustion, the Marine NCO stood at attention and faced Colonel Patterson directly. "Sir, with respect, Captain Mitchell saved our lives," Rodriguez said firmly. "We were surrounded and about to be overrun when she arrived. Without her actions, all 4 Marines would be dead right now." Patterson's expression didn't change. "Sergeant, Captain Mitchell violated direct orders from higher command. The decision to abort the rescue mission was made based on intelligence indicating overwhelming enemy presence. She should have followed orders and returned to base." "Sir, that intelligence was wrong," Rodriguez replied. "We were compromised before the rescue mission even began. Someone leaked our position to the Taliban, and they were waiting for us. Captain Mitchell recognized that we were in immediate danger and acted to save our lives." The conversation was attracting attention from across the base. Soldiers and aircrew were gathering around the helicopter, listening to the heated exchange between Patterson and Rodriguez. Sarah could see the uncertainty in their faces as they tried to understand how saving Marines could result in criminal charges. Corporal Chen stepped forward to support his sergeant, despite the obvious pain from his injuries. "Colonel, Captain Mitchell's aircraft took heavy fire during the rescue. Her crew risked their lives to pull us out of an impossible situation. They could have been killed, but they stayed until all 4 Marines were aboard." Patterson looked around at the growing crowd of observers and realized the situation was getting out of hand. A public argument about the arrest of a pilot who had just rescued 4 Marines was not good for morale or discipline. "All personnel return to your duties immediately," Patterson ordered. "This matter will be handled through proper channels." But the damage was already done. Word of Sarah's arrest spread quickly through the base, creating controversy that reached far beyond Forward Operating Base Chapman. Within hours, reports of the incident were making their way up the chain of command to regional headquarters and eventually to the Pentagon. Sarah spent the next 3 days in a holding cell while investigators reviewed the incident. During that time, she received visits from the 4 Marines she had rescued, each of whom provided detailed statements supporting her actions. Rodriguez, in particular, was adamant that Sarah had saved their lives by refusing to abandon them. The investigation revealed disturbing facts about the original mission planning. Intelligence reports had significantly underestimated Taliban presence in the area, and communications intercepts suggested that the enemy had advanced knowledge of Bravo 7's position. The mission should have been aborted or reinforced before the Marines were ever in danger. Major Park conducted much of the investigation and found herself increasingly sympathetic to Sarah's position. The intelligence failure that had led to the Marines being trapped was significant enough to warrant a separate investigation, but that didn't change the fact that Sarah had disobeyed direct orders. "Captain, I understand why you did what you did," Park told Sarah during one of their interviews. "But the military cannot function if officers decide for themselves which orders to follow and which to ignore. There has to be consequences for breaking the chain of command." Sarah nodded, understanding the position Major Park was in. "I know I broke the rules, Major, but I couldn't live with myself if I had flown away and left those Marines to die. Sometimes the right thing to do isn't the same as following orders." The controversy reached a breaking point when Rodriguez and his team submitted a formal letter to their commanding officer praising Sarah's actions and requesting that she be decorated rather than punished. The letter was forwarded up the Marine Corps chain of command, creating an uncomfortable situation where different branches of the military had opposing views of the same incident. Brigadier General Patricia Williams arrived at the base on the fourth day to personally review the situation. Williams had a reputation as a fair but tough commander who had risen through the ranks as both a pilot and staff officer. Her investigation would determine whether Sarah faced court-martial or received administrative punishment. Williams interviewed everyone involved in the incident, including the Marines who had been rescued, Sarah's crew, and the officers who had issued the original orders. She also reviewed all available intelligence reports and communications transcripts from the day of the rescue. The general's findings were complex and troubling. While Sarah had clearly violated orders, those orders had been based on flawed intelligence that left 4 Marines in mortal danger. The decision to abort the rescue mission had been made by officers who were not in direct contact with the ground situation and didn't understand the immediate threat to American lives. Williams called Sarah into her temporary office for a private meeting. The general's expression was serious, but not hostile as she reviewed the thick folder of documents on her desk. "Captain Mitchell, this is one of the most difficult cases I've encountered in 25 years of service," Williams began. "You clearly violated direct orders which normally would result in court-martial and dismissal from service. However, the circumstances surrounding those orders raise serious questions about command decision-making." Sarah remained silent, knowing that anything she said could be used against her in legal proceedings. Williams continued, "The 4 Marines you rescued have all stated unequivocally that they would have died without your intervention. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez estimates they had less than 10 minutes before being overrun when you arrived. Your actions, while insubordinate, directly saved 4 American lives." The general paused and looked directly at Sarah. "Captain, why did you choose to disobey orders? What made you decide that your judgment was superior to that of your commanding officers?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "General, I had been listening to the radio traffic all morning. I could hear the panic in the voices from other aircraft reporting enemy activity. When we received orders to abort, my instincts told me that something was seriously wrong on the ground. I made a decision based on my experience and the information available to me in the cockpit. And if you had been wrong, if intelligence had been correct and you had flown into a trap that resulted in the loss of your aircraft and crew, then I would have accepted responsibility for that decision, General. But I couldn't accept the responsibility of abandoning those Marines without trying to help them." Williams nodded slowly, making notes in Sarah's file. The conversation continued for another hour, covering every aspect of the incident and Sarah's military record. When it was over, Sarah still had no idea what her fate would be. The general's decision came 2 days later. Williams had consulted with senior officers throughout the military hierarchy, including the Pentagon, before reaching her conclusion. Sarah was called to a formal hearing attended by officers from multiple branches of service. "Captain Mitchell," General Williams announced, "after extensive investigation and consultation with senior command, I have reached the following decision regarding your actions during the rescue of Marine Reconnaissance Team Bravo 7. Sarah stood at attention, prepared for the end of her military career. "You are hereby found guilty of disobeying direct orders and conducting unauthorized combat operations. However, given the extraordinary circumstances surrounding this incident and the lives saved by your actions, this command finds that court-martial proceedings are not warranted." Sarah felt a wave of relief, but Williams wasn't finished. "You will receive a formal letter of reprimand in your personnel file and forfeit 2 months' pay. Additionally, you are temporarily suspended from flight duties pending completion of a command training course on military decision-making and chain of command authority." The punishment was significant, but not career-ending. Sarah would eventually be able to return to flight status, though the reprimand would likely affect her chances for promotion. "Furthermore," Williams continued, "this command recognizes that your actions, while insubordinate, were motivated by a desire to save American lives and demonstrated exceptional courage under fire. You will be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism in aerial combat." The contradiction of being both punished and decorated for the same action perfectly captured the complexity of Sarah's situation. She had violated military law but upheld military values, creating a precedent that would be studied in command schools for years to come. After the hearing, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah on the flight line, where her damaged Chinook was being repaired. The Marine NCO looked serious as he extended his hand to shake hers. "Captain, I want you to know that what you did out there will never be forgotten," Rodriguez said solemnly. "You risked everything to bring us home, and every Marine on this base knows it. That letter of reprimand doesn't change the fact that you're a hero to us." Sarah shook his hand, feeling emotional for the first time since the incident began. "Sergeant, you and your men would have done the same thing for me. That's what we do for each other." Rodriguez smiled and saluted smartly. "Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what we do." 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell returned to full flight status after completing her command training. She continued flying rescue missions throughout her remaining deployment, though she never again faced a situation that required her to choose between orders and conscience. The incident became a case study at the Air Force Academy and other military schools, examining the tension between obedience and moral courage. Some instructors used it to emphasize the importance of following orders, while others pointed to it as an example of principled leadership under pressure. Years later, when Sarah had retired from the military and was working as a civilian pilot, she occasionally received letters from Marines who had heard the story of Bravo 7's rescue. Many of them were young servicemen facing their own difficult decisions about right and wrong in combat situations. Sarah always responded to these letters with the same message. "The military teaches us to follow orders, but it also teaches us to protect each other. Sometimes those two principles come into conflict, and when they do, you have to be prepared to accept the consequences of doing what you believe is right." The 4 Marines of Bravo 7 all completed their deployment safely and returned home to their families. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez eventually became a gunnery sergeant and spent his final years in the Corps training young Marines in small unit tactics. Corporal Chen became a communications instructor, while Washington and Santos both re-enlisted and served multiple additional deployments. All 4 men remained in contact with Sarah throughout their military careers and beyond. Every year on the anniversary of their rescue, they sent her messages of thanks, reminding her that her decision to break orders had allowed them to see their children grow up and grow old with their wives. For Sarah, Those annual messages were worth more than any medal or commendation. She had made the hardest decision of her military career on that dusty mountainside in Afghanistan, choosing conscience over obedience and accepting the consequences. The price had been significant, but the reward, 4 American lives saved, made it worthwhile. The story of Captain Sarah Mitchell and the rescue of Bravo 7 became legend in military aviation circles, passed down from instructor to student as an example of moral courage under impossible circumstances. It reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes the most important decisions are made not by generals in comfortable offices, but by individual soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines facing life-and-death choices in the field. In the end, Sarah Mitchell proved that true leadership sometimes means having the courage to do what you know is right, even when the whole world tells you it's wrong.